It's really hard to describe what Badlands is because the numbers don't really do it justice. There is some fantastic content on YouTube, and I will say that some of it does capture the highs and the lows. You know, people in real distress, people not finishing the race. It's legitimately dangerous because, in short, it's 7 this year. The route changes a little bit every year, but it crosses 2 deserts, depending on how you count, 2 mountain ranges. This year was 791 kilometers. I think about 791 kilometers. That's just under 500 miles. It was over 16,000 meters of elevation gain, which is over 10 miles of straight up, and slightly less descent because the finish of the race is not at the start of the race. It's about 80 kilometers southeast of the start point in Granada. But those numbers, it's almost like when you start talking about big numbers in space or money, they kind of become incomprehensible. It's just a big number. Um, the race has been on since I think the first edition was in 2020, and each year it's become, I think, more and more famous, more and more infamous, and more of a draw as it brings in more and more talent from the pro gravel privateer scene. Last year in 2023, Rob Britton won it. I believe a former World Tour pro who's come into the gravel scene. It attracts a lot of supported, sponsored athletes, and the level just keeps going up and up. There's nothing out there quite like Badlands. There are lots of 500K, 1000K
Right.
brevet races. There's Transalps, Transpyrenees, Transcontinental, Trail Divide. There are these really long races that are thousands of kilometers, and sometimes Trail Divide they have an official start and fastest known time. So in that sense, there's a start and there's a finish. It's a race. But Badlands it's a pretty unique distance. There's a couple other races in Spain actually, that are similar distance and similar profile, but there's nothing that really has the pedigree right now and attracts the same, I think, level of field as Badlands. And there's also something really special about the brutality of the course, and how the real challenges are back-ended. The terrain challenges are really back-ended, and it's just I'm gonna say the last 150K are just above category climb after descending down the same one, and then back up to the same ridge line, and then back down and back up, and you lose count. How many of these things are we going to do? And interspersed with these dry river beds full of sand, and then back onto a rocky sort of boulder climb and a little bit of hike a bike, and it becomes sort of comical at a certain point. And you do these calculations ahead of time in terms of what's my average speed got to be if I'm going to finish in under 2 days and be competitive. And it's just not it's not an accurate way to look at that race because there's so much time spent in these super technical, super dangerous. Well, on a normal day, probably not dangerous, but after 36 hours, 40 hours with no sleep, pretty dangerous nighttime single track descents with a bike that's heavier than usual. Handles not that you're not quite used to it handling because you've got all kinds of stuff strapped to it. It's just diabolical. But the places you see, the 2 deserts, the mountains, the villages you go through, the hospitality, these towns turn out all night for the riders. It's a really special event. And there's this sort of marriage between these villages and this race and this event and the riders who come through. And it's just really special. And by the way, it's completely unsupported. So there's no aid stations. What you have with you is what you have with you until you find a bodega or a bar along the way, occasional restaurant, to hit the odd gas station. But you've got to do your recon ahead of time. So there's some stretches that are 100. I think the longest stretch without any support or any sort of store or water fountain is about 100 kilometers. But that 100 kilometers cracks a lot of people because it's in the Garafe Desert, and it's the middle of the day, the first day, and it's 100 kilometers. I don't know how much climbing is in that specific 100K, but you have several of these concrete 20%, 25% plus ramps in and out of these river valleys. And the bulk of it is in these river valleys, half of which are just unrideable sand. But this 100K stretch is people routinely run out of water, and you've got to make your way through and you've got to burn some matches to get through it, and really manage having enough water. A lot of people thought about having enough nutrition, but it's the day I went through, the Garmin was reading 105 in the sun. It was super, super hot. Just difficult to do justice to the challenge with words. I was really attracted to the race because it was hard. I mean, it had this reputation. Um, it it was something that scared me a bit, and I think maybe similar to a lot of other folks who pursue these sort of ultra events, I like to pursue things that scare me just a bit. And this one fit the bill. The longest ride I'd done before this one was 505 kilometers last summer, almost a year previous. But that one was almost entirely road. It was in Belgium, big loop from Liège to Chimay, down touching to France, Luxembourg, and then back through the Ardennes. So quite a bit of climbing, but almost entirely paved. The weather was crap, but
I'm going to interject. He won. He beat the second place finishers, which was a team, by a couple hours.
Yeah, that went pretty well. It was a good day. Again, Vespa on board all the way. And that whet my appetite for ultra cycling because it was my first ultra on a bike. I'd done lots of 200K rides, but I don't really consider that an ultra. I mean, especially when you're fit and you're booking through 200K, you're done, 6-7 hours. But the 500K, that was a legit ultra, and it whet my appetite and made me recognize that perhaps I had some talent at this distance, and not just talent, but wisdom of having done several similar type efforts in the ultra running world, and some accumulated wisdom.
I think that's a really important thing across the whole spectrum of people starting out in sports in their 20s. They don't have that wisdom, and they need to realize that. They've got the metabolism and the drive to do it, but I think that's why it attracts middle-aged to older people to these endurance sports, because a lot of it is managing, and as we were talking about earlier, it really forces you to adapt and continually adapt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you learn a lot about yourself and fueling and hydration and heat adaptation and all these things that you really learn the hard lessons by making big mistakes. It goes without saying, but it's worth repeating. And I'd say going into Badlands, from my experience with OFM and Vespa throughout my ultra running and triathlon experience, and then into cycling, it was one of the things I had zero stress, absolutely zero stress about nutrition or hydration or heat adaptation, because that's separate. But I focused quite a bit on heat adaptation before this race. But looking around at the other folks I started with, and how much gel and Haribo and extra weight of nutrition they had strapped into their bikes and stuffed into their bags, you almost kind of feel bad. Like, there's another way, there's a better way, right? Yeah, I had a couple caffeine gels with me, and I had the strategic carbs. I carried maybe 7 packets of the Morton 320, and because I find it to be really digestible. But at no point was I planning to actually attempt to replace the 21,000 calories it was going to take me to get through this race, which is ultimately, at the power meter, at the pedals, what my computer told me I put into the pedals at the end of 52 hours was 21,000 kilojoules. And I think there's still just this mentality out there that, my gosh, I've been on the bike for however many hours and I'm 5,000 kilojoules in, but I've only had 1,500, 2,000 calories, and the paradigm shift just doesn't happen. That's actually okay if you're metabolically efficient. That's actually okay. It's as I'm sure you've talked about in the podcast before, and we've talked about at length, like, after you make that reset and you become primarily a fat burner, it's okay, and it's something you kind of stop worrying about and stop thinking about, and you think about when you're going to have to burn a match, and strategic carbs, and making sure that you're taking that on board when you need it. But when you're steady state, it's just a trickle. It's and you listen to your hunger and thirst cues, and it's just sort of namaste. It's not something to get so stressed out about, and have the Garmin timer going off every 30 minutes, eat a gel, eat a gel, eat a gel. And you see folks similar to marathon and ultra marathon just with this gut distress, and you just start to think there's a better way. It's so much more enjoyable.